Good evening, my friends. I hope you're comfortable. Maybe tucked into bed, maybe with the lights dimmed just right. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you can join me for more nights like this. And tell me, in the comments, and where are you watching from and what time is it there? Now close your eyes if you'd like, and let these basement stories carry you into the dark. By the time anyone admitted there was a smell, it had been there long enough to have its own weather. On damp mornings, it rode the mist that drifted across Maple Street, a sour sweetness that clung to the magnolia blossoms and stalled in throats. On hot days, it got inside your clothes, a laundry day ghost that outlasted detergent. It came out of the rental at 118 Maple, a small salt box house with aluminum siding that flashed like fish scales when the sun hit right, and a porch swing that moved a little even on windless afternoons. Nobody pressed too hard about it, not at first. The landlord, a barrel-chested man named Avery Callan, who owned half the rentals in town, always shrugged. Old pipes, he'd say, and roll his hand as if that explained a recurring fever. Got a plumber out last month. You know how these houses are, settling. People wanted to believe him. The town of Brights Ferry ran on belief the way other places ran on natural gas. Belief that hard winters weren't as hard as they used to be. Belief that the paper mill upstream really had improved its filtration. Belief that certain families were bad luck in the bones and there wasn't much use saying otherwise. Maple Street had tidy hedges. It had a block party and an email list and a book club that staggered through 5 novels a year. It had a smell that belonged to someone else's problem. After school, kids cut across the ditch by the rental, riding their bikes with their shirts pulled up to cover their noses. "Skunk," said little Caleb Pearson, who'd never met a problem he couldn't name. "Skunk for sure." His father corrected him, "Dead squirrel under the crawl space." His mother corrected the father, "Mildew." "It's the river," she said, as if the river were a person with bad hygiene. Some overflow in the storm drains. Behind the blinds at 118 Maple, a tenant moved now and then. Not the same one, although for a while it felt that way. A girl with a nose ring who wore hoodies, then a quiet man who did night shifts at the warehouse, then a woman who smoked on the back steps and spoke on the phone in a language the neighbors couldn't place. 3 tenants in a year and a half. Bad. Luck like rotten fruit in a bowl. One piece goes, then another. The smell outlasted them. When the house sat empty, the odor changed character, like a voice trying on different accents. There was ammonia one week and a cloying perfume the next. It was easy to forget until someone's dog stopped on the sidewalk and refused to budge, bristling at nothing. The porch swing creaked, the porch light flickered, and the bulb would be burned out by morning. What people didn't say at the potluck, or in their email threads, was that Brights Ferry had been shedding residents. A barista who'd been saving for community college disappeared the summer before. Her mother posted pleas on Facebook with an optimism that felt brittle as spun sugar. A man who did odd jobs, sometimes for Avery himself, vanished around Christmas. His tools left neatly laid out on a sawhorse as if he'd stepped away to piss. A teenage boy took his girlfriend's car and never came back. The car turned up 2 towns over with the keys in the ignition. A strand of cheap Mardi Gras beads looped over the rearview mirror. Sheriff's deputies knocked on doors, took statements, pushed photographs across kitchen tables. "If you see anything unusual," they said, which in Brights Ferry was thin instruction. Everything unusual was someone's shame, and shame made for thick curtains. In mid-April, a code enforcement letter went out. The letter did not mention a smell. It mentioned a padlock on an exterior door that violated fire safety codes. The lock was on a hatch at the back of 118 Maple, a square of weathered wood flush with the ground. The kind of hatch you'd think was for storm cellars if storms ever came that way. The hatch had a length of chain looped through 2 iron rings, and the lock was big, the kind that looked heavy in your palm. Folks had seen it and assumed tenants had been storing something down there, a lawnmower maybe, or bikes. Avery said he'd deal with it. He said it the way he said everything, words handed out like receipts. When he didn't, the town sent another letter. When that didn't work, the town sent Nate Whitmore. Nate had been a lineman before he blew out his knee on a fall that could have killed him. He did inspections for the town now, wore a reflective vest like a badge. He took pictures and cited cracked walkways and pet waste left at the curb. You wouldn't have known it from his slow, careful way of moving, but fear ran out of Nate's pores like salt. Too many close calls had braided his nerves into something tender as raw dough. He approached the hatch at 118 Maple with the same caution he gave to downed lines. The smell met him halfway down the side path. It had the sour milk edge of rot, but also the sharpness you get from a pantry spill, something sugary left to harden and then turned. Nate crouched by the hatch, peering at the lock. The chain was new. The rings in the wood were not. They'd been there long enough that the wood around them had smoothed to a dark sheen from fingers, maybe from a habitual tug. He photographed everything. He called Avery and got voicemail. Sheriff's Deputy Crowther showed up 15 minutes later because Nate uncharacteristically had asked. Crowther was a broad-shouldered kid with freckles and a haircut that could have been done by a bull. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and chewed a peppermint. "We got a warrant?" "Not yet," Nate said. His knee ached. "We got a code violation." The peppermint clicked against Crowther's teeth. "He'll say it's storage." Nate nodded toward the hatch. "You ever smell storage?" They knocked on the door of the rental out of courtesy. Nobody answered. Nate wrote "entry attempted." No response, in his pocket notebook. And only then did Crowther leverage the chain with a bolt cutter that made a noise like a jawbone snapping. The hatch lifted with reluctance. It groaned as if it had learned the language of protest from the porch swing. Cold air moved across Nate's face, licked at his eyes, and brought the smell so intimately close that he flinched, forehead creasing. There were stairs beneath, narrow wooden treads, and at the bottom a dark that behaved like a material. You could sense its weight, its surface. Crowther took his flashlight and drew a cone of light down the steps. "What in?" he began, and then rephrased it. "Okay." It was a basement that had learned to lie. The walls looked like cinder block at first glance, but the beam revealed hastily skim-coated panels over something else, something coarser, like soundproofing. The ceiling was low, rough with joists. The floor was poured concrete with a subtle pitch, the way you'd build a slaughterhouse to let fluids run. There was a drain at the lowest point, and the metal grate over it showed new screws, their slots unmarred except for two that had been stripped by an impatient hand. On a folding table sat a cardboard caddy full of cleaning supplies, industrial, bleach, a brown bottle of peracetic acid, a flat of cheap pine-scented deodorizer like you get at dollar stores stacked by the window registers, a plug-in air freshener pulsed in the outlet like a medical device, a home-use humidifier labored in a corner, its tank cloudy with scale. The smell threw all those efforts into a cruel relief. Odors layered like the strata of a road cut. Chemical, sweet animal. There were two other things. A camera pointed at the stairs, its little black eye winking red like a firefly in a jar, and a door in the back wall, the kind of door you'd put on a closet if you wanted the closet to pretend it wasn't there. The camera was easy. Crowther plucked its battery, put it in an evidence bag. The door was not easy. It was newer than the rest of the space, heavy, with a keyhole below a handle that had very little wear. Crowther put his ear to it and made a face. Nate swallowed and didn't ask why. "Let's get out," Crowther said, surprisingly soft. "We do this by the book." They went up the steps, already feeling the basement as something that had pressed the shape of them into itself, like memory. On the way to the cruiser, Nate's knee twinged so hard he had to stop. He told Crowther to go. "You get the warrant," he said. "I'll wait." Avery Callan pulled up before the deputy returned. He parked where the cruiser would need to, go and swung himself out of his truck with an ease that suggested he thought the world would make room when he needed it. He wore a windbreaker with his property management logo stitched in white, and his mouth made an O when he saw Nate by the hatch. "What are you doing?" he asked, not curious. "Violation," Nate said. "You think that gives you the right to break into my property?" "The code gives us the right," Nate said. "And someone's been breaking into your tenants." A flare of something passed across Avery's face then, there and gone. "Excuse me?" "People," Nate said, more blunt than he meant to be. "They've been disappearing." "Not from here," Avery said. "It's been 2 weeks. Everyone's been gone. and looked almost satisfied with himself when he said it. Crowther came back with 2 patrol cars and a man with a mustache that gave him instant authority. The mustache had a warrant in its pocket. Later, a phalanx of law enforcement arrived, county state, a tech with a white case on wheels that squeaked every third turn. Neighbors stood on their porches with their arms folded. The book club paused its discussion of genre conventions. The smell lay in the street like fog. The lock on the inside door required a locksmith with patience and a set of tools that looked intimate. When it finally yielded, it did so not with the defeated thunk of a door opening, but with a sigh, as though the room behind it had been holding its breath. The hidden chamber was smaller than the basement proper, and almost painfully tidy. The walls were insulated and then sheathed in a textured vinyl the color of unsalted butter. There was a cot with a thin mattress, a chair that could have been stolen from a church basement, a row of plastic bins neatly labeled in block capitals, shoelaces, combs, napkins, bottles, tape. A portable toilet stood in a corner screen with a tension rod curtain, the kind you'd put in a student rental to approximate privacy. A light hung bare. There was no window. On a table sat a notebook. It might not have been the first thing anyone noticed, but it became the only thing that mattered. It was one of those composition books with the marbled cover, but the marbling had been rubbed away by a thumb in one spot, until the paper showed through like skin scraped by a fall. The first page was headed Rules, the second, Reasons, the third, Communications. No one said hostage. The room was too clinical for that, too sanitary, too conscious of words the way a person is conscious of their breath while lying about, their health. Containment, someone said. Restraint. The notebook used none of those. It used the word keeping. Keeping is a kindness, one entry read, careful printing that tilted all the same direction. The world outside makes people worse. After a period of adjustment, they become grateful for order. Subject 1, S1, engaged in screaming for 9 hours and 20 minutes on day 1. Subject 1 later apologized for the noise and complied with the rules. Subjects are like pets or children. They require boundaries. People in this town walk around without leashes and call it freedom. They track in mud. A second notebook appeared behind a false panel that Crowther found because he was the kind of kid who tapped walls in his grandmother's house looking for hollow places to hide from cousins. This one contained Polaroids. They were not pornographic. They were worse for not being pornographic. They were domestic. People asleep. People eating. People with their mouths open as if to speak, but the moment had been frozen and stolen before the word arrived. The sheriff stood at the hatch breathing hard through his mouth, as if he needed to pull air from somewhere the smell wasn't. Call the families, he said to no one in particular and everyone at once. In the days that followed, the town rearranged its furniture. People walked the neighborhood as if space itself were suspect. A volunteer brought coffee to the officers who stood a perimeter that felt ceremonial. A neighbor scrubbed her mailbox with Lysol. The book club abandoned the novel with an unreliable narrator because reality had outpaced the device. The internet beamed in like weather again. Reporters who needed Bright's Ferry to tell a story about itself that would fit in 3 minutes between a pharmaceutical ad and the last act of the 11 o'clock news. Quiet Street, they said, making the quiet a character of its own. Foul odor, they said, and smiled like anchors do when they pretend not to be thrilled. A padlock. They loved the padlock. Avery was interviewed, and he was good at it because he'd been practicing for years. He was shocked, he said. He hadn't been inside because tenants have rights, he said. He blamed subletters and itinerants and the mills, layoffs. He kept his voice sorrowful for 3 sentences and then turned it firm, emphatic. We have a community to heal. Something about him on television reminded people of when he ran for school board and lost by 12 votes. He'd borrowed the same words then. The question that chewed the rim of every coffee mug and every late-night conversation was simple, and it never got easy. Who? If you assembled the town's probably list into a collage, you could cover the walls of the hidden chamber and not have any space left for paint. People talked about the tenant with the hoodies and the tenant with the night shift and the woman with the phone calls and the odd jobs man who had owed Avery money. They talked about Avery himself. They talked about Nate because small towns eat their own when frightened. They talked about a teacher who hugged too long and a pastor's son who drank and a woman who ran the food pantry and once took back a loaf of bread because the woman who'd asked for it had a look. In the end, the chamber had only one owner, whoever had written the notebooks. And the hand that wrote those entries belonged to someone who admired order. Nate, for his part, stopped sleeping for more than 30 minutes at a stretch. He sat at his kitchen table with the notebooks printed out in photographs, the text enlarged until the heartbreak was enormous and grainy. He thought about the line, "Keeping is a kindness." He thought about what kind of person could live that sentence for days, months. Then he thought about the smell, the way it had tried so hard to be other things. He remembered the drain and the new screws, the stripped slots. On the fourth day after the hatch came open, a neighbor at the back of Maple Street, an old woman with a cat who yowled at everything that lived in wire or pipe, called 911 because her storm drain was making a sound. "Music," she said, and then apologized. "Not music. Humming." The drain was the outlet for the same line that ran beneath 118 Maple, concrete tubes laid in the 50s when the town still believed in shovel-ready projects and men in hard hats. Utility workers went down, then officers, then a team from the state with respirators and lights. They followed the line to a junction where it bent like an elbow and found, tucked into a cavity in the concrete, a cache of things. Hair elastics, a toothbrush still in its packaging, a flattened paper cone from a snowball stand 3 counties away. They found another camera, its battery long dead. They found a coil of cord cut into careful lengths, each with tape at the end to keep it from fraying. The tunnel made a sound when they were down there. It wasn't music, no. It was breath. Air came from somewhere, not above, not below. Lurking air, borrowed air. They shut off their lamps and listened, and in the pure dark, the sound became wilder in their heads, a house inhaling. The tech with the squeaky case did something with a sensor and shook her head. "It's pressure equalization," she said, not needing anyone to believe her. "Heat moves, trapped air moves." Behind those cool words was the first rule of the chamber, the one not written on the page labeled rules. Rooms are organisms. You feed them with light and chemicals and sound, and they grow mechanisms of appetite. You give them a story about kindness, and they give you a way to lock from the inside. Here and there, as the weeks passed and the property was combed and recombed until the grass gave up, the community tried on its outfits of outrage and grief. A candlelight vigil. A fundraiser for a family whose daughter's photo had hung in the gas station near the gum. A petition to tear down 118 Maple. Avery fought that one. "It's an asset," he said, forgetting himself. And the petitioners switched tactics. Keep the house and force him to live in it a year. The town clerk said you couldn't make those kinds of rules out of pain. Nate went back to the basement once, alone, after the crime scene tape had come down and the door had resumed its everyday habit of being a door. He had permission because he had keys, because he had stayed close to the case in a way that looked like competence, if you didn't know the shape of compulsion. He went because he wanted to see what remained when everyone stopped naming it. Some rooms looked bigger when emptied. Some looked more like their true size. The hidden chamber looked like a lie that had taken off its jacket to stretch. The smell should have been gone. New filters had been placed in the humidifier. The drain had been treated. Still, a faint sweetness hung in corners, the way fruit stands smell in the hour before closing. He turned in a circle, a slow animal checking the air, and then he saw it. The padlock. It lay on the concrete like a toy a child has lost interest in. The cut in the shackle was clean, bright as a new moon. Nate picked it up. It felt warm where it should have been cold. He set it on the table, on a clean square where dust hadn't yet settled. The notebook lay there too, in its plastic sleeve, tagged and numbered, awaiting transport to a different evidence room because paperwork moves at the speed of ambient dread. Through the plastic, the print angled toward him. People in this town walk around without leashes and call it freedom. A sound rose from somewhere. the humidifier's motor humming uneasily, then settling, a tick in the cooling metal of the air duct. A quiet pat, 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 like a child's hand testing how close it could get to a flame. Nate left the chamber's door open and walked up the tight stairs. He stood by the hatch and looked out into the afternoon light, which felt like a lie of its own. Maple Street was spring-trimmed, lawns lying green as if nothing grew beneath them but earth. He thought of the storm line. He imagined it as the town's second throat swallowing what no one wanted to taste. He set the padlock on the hatch because he wanted to see it there in the day. He wanted the sun on it, to take the chill of the basement out of its metal. He wanted it defined by light. He turned to go and then stopped. Somewhere close, impossibly close, something clicked. It was a small sound, a mechanical syllable. The kind of sound you hear when keys find their home on a hook, when a bike seat ratchets down a notch, when a clock with a smooth face marks a minute anyway. Nate looked down. The padlock lay where he'd put it, the cut shackle parted like a mouth that had been instructed to smile. Slow, as if guided by a hand that had learned patience inside a tight room, the two lips met. Metal kissed metal. The shackle reseated itself into its housing and stopped. There was no power in it, no magic, only gravity and the twitch of a table's leg and a shiver from a freight train 3 streets over that everyone in town had learned to ignore. But as the shackle slid home, the lock made that small announcement of closure, that subtle, satisfied click. Nate's chest went tight. He wanted to laugh, because the world is full of simple explanations for meanings we paste over like bright labels. He waited for his own laugh to come and sound normal. It didn't. Downstairs, the humidifier gave one wrong gulp and pried itself into silence. The house held the pause the way a held breath holds a prayer. From the storm drain at the curb, a bubble rose and broke with a sound like a parent shushing a child. The porch swing creaked and then creaked again, faint as a sleepwalker's footfall. Somewhere, a dog pulled its leash taut and began whining at nothing. Across the street, a neighbor paused with a grocery bag and looked at 118 Maple the way you look at a person who has said something so strange you can't decide if you've misheard. Her mouth made a small O. Nate reached down to the lock and lifted it. The shackle didn't hold. It sprang back open with a sting of metal recoil, as if the thing had only been pretending to be shut, the way the town had been pretending to be safe. He stood with it in his palm and felt the shape of the basement in his bones, a negative he'd carry into sleep. The town would tear down 118 Maple eventually, or it would rent it again, because rent is gravity. Grass would grow back. Kids would cut across the ditch and call the smell something else. In the storm line under the street, the air would keep moving, a slow animal tide. Rooms, like people, learn what you teach them. The chamber would remember light at odd hours. It would remember rules written in careful print. It would remember hands that believed themselves kind. And at the first big summer thunderstorm, when rain fell hard enough to drum every roof into sameness, the hatch behind the house would flutter against its new chain. The chain would be newer than the one before, and the lock would be newer still, stamped shiny as a coin. In a lull between thunder, if you stood very close, you could hear through wood and dirt and insulation the small, eager sound a room makes when it senses a door beginning to open. The day Millie Dunn disappeared was the first day the town of Larchwood smelled like spring. Mud, thawed leaves, and the paper mill's sour breath drifting up the river. The thaw made everything feel temporary. The last of the snow slipped, off porch roofs in fat, wet sighs. Asphalt bled through the winter's patchwork. When the elementary let out, children went home in squeals and bright coats, and drivers slowed for the crosswalk like they always had. The crossing guard, Mr. Klein, raised his orange paddle and waved them through. He told the Dunn girl, dark hair, skinny legs, backpack that had a rabbit keychain, "You be good now," in a voice he'd practiced on his own kids and later on his grandkids. Always, she'd said, because she was that kind of girl, 9 going on 30, the sort who lined her pencils in color order and could make a bed so tight her mother joked a quarter would bounce off it. She walked the 3 blocks down Chestnut, Past the white church with the sign that still read, "He is risen," 2 weeks after Easter. Past the vacant lot where teenagers flicked cigarette butts and pretended not to be seen. Past the Dalrymple house, with the rhododendrons that always seemed to bloom too early and get bitten by frost. Then she was gone. Larchwood wasn't the sort of place that believed in sudden vanishments. Things went missing in inches here. The mill closed 2 job lines. The diner took burgers off the menu and stopped serving after 10. The high school swapped Friday night football lights for dimmer bulbs to save money and called the half-dark atmosphere. You didn't misplace a whole child. And yet there was Millie's mother at the threshold of their duplex, calling, "Mills?" as the air cooled, then calling it again in a smaller voice, peering down the rent house hallway as if the kid might have flat-packed herself and slid under a bed. By nightfall, the volunteers were out. Men with flashlights that made cones in the mist. Women with clipboards, kids with the restless hunger of sanctioned adventure. Deputy Hannah Cole knocked on doors, jaw set, hair in a rubber band gone gummy with age, and made lists because lists were nights when the world tilted, and the wrongness of it all threatened to throw a person off like a mechanical bull. She collected little truths. Mr. Klein saw the child. Mrs. Dalrymple watered her plants. 2 teenagers swore they saw a white van. They didn't. Later, the camera at the car wash would show them vaping behind the dumpsters. A man in a ball cap. No ball cap man was found. A cat with a crooked tail. That cat belonged to the church's pianist and had crooked its tail for years. The river glugged and sulked past the bridge as if it knew something the town did not. By the second week, flyers with Millie's school photo, chin tilted bravely, teeth too big for her mouth, curled at the corners on telephone poles and bulletin boards at the feed store. The church put together a spaghetti dinner. The Dunns ate off paper plates with plastic forks like mourners at a wake that hadn't declared itself awake yet. A woman in line, one of those who made every tragedy a mirror, said to Millie's father, "When my cousin's boy went, it was the mother's boyfriend," then flapped a hand as if erasing the words from the air. "It's not," he said. He was a quiet man who worked overnights at the printing plant. People said he kept to himself, the way people say that when they're trying out blame-like suits in a fitting room. Hannah slept in her office twice that month, head on her folded jacket. The town supervisor didn't like that the state police had sent a man who made things about statistics and roads. "It's not geometry, it's Millie," the supervisor said, and the stat man nodded and kept laying transparent maps over Larchwood, like he could triangulate evil. Hannah kept to her lists. She walked the riverbank where it collected refrigerators and tire rims. She stood in crawl spaces where dust lay thick as attic snow. She sat with the Dunns and asked them the questions you ask because you have to. Did you fight? Did she run away before? Does she know anyone online? Did anyone new start coming around? She watched the mother's throat work, watched the father's hands worry at the edges of a styrofoam cup until it creaked like a mouse. Weeks went by. Then a utility complaint came in from a woman on Walnut Street, a widow with a neat lawn who collected lawn dwarfs. Her electricity bill had tripled without explanation. "Something's wrong with the meter," she told the clerk. The clerk, who liked to tell stories later about moments like this, how the world had turned under her feet without her knowing, entered a work order. A municipal electrician, one of those men who could tell you the weight of storms by how wires sang, went out to look. He frowned at the readings, scratched his chin, followed the line to the basement bulkhead of the rental next door, one of a handful the town's quiet contractor kept, the ones the land trust complained about. Deferred maintenance was the phrase. The bulkhead was padlocked, but the padlock was cheap. The electrician had bolt cutters in the truck. He popped it and shouldered the doors open. A smell came up like the breath of a shut-in. Bleach, damp concrete, something sweet like baby powder, and the faintest hint of the river's forever rot. He listened. The house above was empty, foreclosed last fall, the bank sign half fallen. But the basement held sound, the whir of a dehumidifier, a thin electronic chime repeating at regular intervals, the insect hum of fluorescent tubes. He called it in. Hannah arrived with 2 uniforms and a pry bar. She went down first. Police. Wanted to say they were brave, but bravery is habit. A muscle you flex because it's the only one you have. The basement was poured concrete with a line of efflorescence like lace at the seam where wall met floor. It had been painted gray once, then painted again. On the far wall, a second wall had been built, an interior wall that made the room false, shy, like someone doing a bad imitation of normal. Framing, soundproof insulation, drywall. A door cut into it with a knob that gleamed new. The door had no exterior hardware. On the inside, you could turn it to lock the world out. Christ, one of the uniforms said under his breath. Save it, Hannah said. She put her ear to the place where door met frame and heard the chime. Nearer now, and another sound like paper being turned in a steady, reverent way. She knocked. County Sheriff's Office, she said. My name's Hannah. If anyone's in there, I'm not here to hurt you. Silence. Then the rustle stopped and a small voice, a dry leaf of a voice that had learned the shapes different silences took, said, You're late for tea. Hannah looked at the uniform. We're coming in, she said to the door, and then she pried the latch with the bar and the wood split, and the door went with a shudder like something letting go of an old grudge. Inside, the room was too bright. 4 fluorescent tubes buzzed with that moth-seeking light that flattens faces and throws shadows in cruel directions. There was no window. The far wall had been papered in a pattern of climbing roses, old-fashioned English grandmother roses. The ceiling was painted baby blue. On the floor lay a braided rug she recognized from the discount store on 4th. Hannah had the same one in her bathroom. There were curtains on the false window, white with little bows. A narrow bed with a ruffle. A child-sized table with 2 chairs. And everywhere, facing the bed, sitting at the table, standing in a regiment on shallow shelves, porcelain dolls, dozens, maybe more. Each wore a dress, each lifted its painted mouth not quite to a smile. Each had eyes of polished glass. Black, blue, green. One had brown eyes with a fleck of amber that caught the light like something alive. Their lashes were real. Hannah could see where they had been glued in. Little clumps clung to porcelain lids like spider eggs. In the middle of it all stood Millie Dunn. A week's dirt would have shown itself in a home like hers. Here, you wouldn't have known it had been weeks. Someone had washed and braids had been made, too tight, like someone copying a picture. The child wore a pale blue dress that puffed at the sleeves. There was a ribbon in her hair. She held a tiny saucer, white, with a gold rim, and her hands shook just enough that the saucer made a quick bird noise against the cup. Hi, Millie, Hannah said, though something in her had wanted to say sorry. You missed the bell, the girl said, eyes big but not with fear, bigger, stranger, as if all the fear had been pressed flat and put in a drawer for later. You have to come when the bell rings, or else it's rude. You have to sit and you have to pour. You have to be good. Her gaze darted to a doll in a red dress and then to the corner where a small metal speaker, one of those old intercom boxes you see in 50s houses, glinted. It clicked once, softly, like a throat being cleared behind a closed door. Hannah stepped toward the table. You want to come out of here with me? She asked. We can go outside. We can get your mom. Millie looked at the dolls. When she spoke, it was in the rhythm of repetition, the way a person talks who has only been allowed to recite. We don't go on the floor. We don't cry. We don't use our outside voice. We don't like the dark. We stay where the teacher can see us. We don't like it when people knock. We don't open doors for strangers. By then, the uniforms were in the doorway with blankets like pennants. Hannah glanced at the shelf. One of the dolls had hair that lay oddly, snipped blunt at the nape as if cut by small scissors. On the chalkboard propped beside the dolls, a chalkboard because of course a schoolroom needs a chalkboard, someone had written the word lesson in long, neat capitals. Below it a list, sitting, smiling, listening, special. Who wrote that, honey? Hannah asked, gently, and the girl's eyes went to the speaker again, as if it were a person. It clicked twice this time. Hannah's skin pebbled. There were teddy bears, too. 6 of them, old-fashioned with jointed arms. Their paws were stitched in dark squares. And Hannah was not a person prone to dramatic thoughts. She was a woman who had known kidney stones and taxes and a divorce and returned them each to their boxes when dealt with. But she would later swear the stitching looked like letters knocking at the door of meaning and not being let in. They took Millie out and she went willingly, though her steps were measured, careful, like she had learned early that the floor might not be where you thought. She did not speak until they reached the sidewalk and the air was in her face. Then she said, "Do we have to come back when it's time?" She looked up at the sky and squinted like it would give a schedule. The wind lifted her ribbon, set it fluttering. "No, sweetheart," Hannah said, and her voice broke in a place it did not usually break. "We don't have to come back." Inside, the uniforms pulled the room apart like an onion. Behind the chalkboard, a niche with a stack of workbooks. Not school workbooks, photocopied pages of a teacher's guide, good behavior, healthy choices. The pages had been hole-punched and bound with brass fasteners. The cover had a name pressed with one of those label makers. Larchwood Elementary, staff copy. Hannah paged through. Each lesson had a place for notes, and someone had written in. A steady hand about each student. Sits well after bell. Needs encouragement to sip. Does not like when lights flicker. Responds to music. Hannah came to a page where the child's name wasn't Millie. The dates were older. The latest note ran off the bottom margin. Absent, absent, absent. Basements. Got an extension, one of the uniforms said. It's not on the plan. He had the municipal plans for the house, wrinkled at the folds. There's a crawl space behind the back wall that goes under the addition. Poured slab over it. Hard to see without knowing what you're looking at. Who owns the property? Hannah asked. The record said, Greaves, Arthur, a contractor, with good references. Quiet. Paid taxes on time, did the Christmas toy drive with a big check that made it into the paper. His number rang to voicemail. Nobody called back. The cruiser out at his small ranch on County 12 saw his pickup in the drive, and a basement window blacked out from the inside, and someone thought of the speaker in the concrete room, the way it clicked like a tongue on a pallet. And the hair on everybody's neck stood up in chorus. They found him upstairs. Not dead, not armed. It would have made a clean newspaper paragraph if he had been either. He was at the kitchen table, watching dust slant through the lattice of a shade that had never quite been opened. He had a school cafeteria tray in front of him with 3 plates arranged in a line, each with exactly half a sandwich, crusts off, triangles pointing north. The watch on his wrist was one of those rubbery ones coaches wore that could time a mile. He set a fork down like he was done eating with a child's care. It wasn't safe for her out there, he said when they cuffed him. You know what's out there? You know what people do to children? I made a place where it's always daylight and nobody has to be scared. Where are the others, Arthur? Hannah asked, because she had learned by then that there are always other questions knitted to the first. Always other rooms behind the wall you're looking at. He lifted his hands as much as the cuffs allowed and tilted them back and forth, a motion between one thing and another. You're making a story, he said. That's a cheap trick. This isn't that kind of story. It's an educational environment. I kept track. I had outcomes. You read the outcomes. You'll see. He smiled, a smile that showed a boy under the man. A boy who had sat with his hands flat on a desk and watched the clock, watched the second hand go around like a razor blade. The news trucks came like crows. The spaghetti dinner turned into casseroles left on porches and then into casseroles picked up again because what do you feed a family in the middle of a story you don't understand? People who hadn't spoken in years spoke in the line at the post office. He was always polite, somebody said, meaning Greaves. I never did like him, somebody else said. Sleep became a thing with seams. The town's night split into careful patches. The church sign changed to pray for Millie, and then to thank you, God, and then to be vigilant. Millie gave statements in a soft voice in a room with a vase of fake flowers that sent their pale library smell into everything. A counselor sat with a notebook and drew quiet boxes around her words. Hannah didn't sit in on the recordings. She didn't believe in recording children where she could look them in the eye and know she might blink at the wrong time. She went home and stood in her own basement once, hand on the chain of the single bulb, and listened to the house breathe. Houses always have air moving through them. People forget. It comes up through cracks and travels along studs. It carries the smell of the ground and whatever history is in it. Oil, old spills, pet hair, mint, damp cardboard. Hannah thought there are basements you know and basements you don't. It hadn't felt like a religious thought until that moment. Greaves's lawyer said he was a misunderstood soul, said the room was a nursery, special education, that the dolls, he said education aids, proved thoughtfulness. He used a phrase Hannah had to repeat twice to the detective from the state, because it sounded so much like a punchline, protective custody. He would have done better not to talk. The more he explained, the more his words made people in Larchwood itch, like insulation up their sleeves. He said he had been a janitor at the school once. He said he had watched lessons, had learned how to schedule time and practice skills. He said he had sweetened the air with baby powder to impose safety. He said fluorescent lights mimic noon. He said a bell is important because a bell tells you when to stop and when to start, and human beings are happiest when they are told. The owner of the antique store on Main recognized 2 of the dolls. He bought those from me last summer, she told the paper. Very particular about the eyes. Particular how? The reporter asked, thrusting. Oh, the woman said and put a hand to her throat. Oh, but there was no roll call of other missing children in Larchwood. There were the names on the shelves in the room behind the wall. Hannah had seen them, written in neat hand under the dolls on a strip of masking tape, names that belonged to the dolls like a teacher labeling cubbies. And there were the notations in the binder about absent students. And there were the workbooks with circles for gold stars that had been filled in with a ballpoint pen in a mature hand. But the state pulled records, checking every town within 100 miles, and the math did not resolve into a nightmare of seriality. The faraway amber fleck in one doll's eye belonged to glass. The strands glued to lashes had been taken from extension kits. The hair was cut from wigs. You want there to be a pattern, the stat man told Hannah. It feels like relief to see one, but sometimes there's just the one terrible thing, and that's harder, Hannah said. It isn't harder. She thought of the chalkboard, of the word lesson, of how no one had erased it since the chalk wrote itself there, and it would outlast them all if left alone. Chalk is limestone, and limestone is old ocean, and what is written on the ocean stays. It's just different. People left little gifts on the Dunn's porch, potted plants, a crocheted blanket with a prayer stitched into it. The man who ran the junkyard brought 2 old bikes and said the kid could pick one. We'll paint it, he said. We'll make it hers. Millie took the one with worn tires and a chrome bell that had lost its shine to other people's fingers. She set it in the yard and put her hand on the bell and didn't ring it. You could see her thinking, bells mean you come. Sometimes, you could hear her talking when no one was near. Not in a ghost story way, in a human way that made the hair rise anyhow. She sat on the braid of the porch step with her rabbit keychain backpack and arranged 3 pebbles in a row and spoke to them gently and said, When I pour, we all say thank you. One day she asked her mother where the fluorescent light lived in their house, and when her mother said they didn't have one, not in this house, and there was daylight for free through the windows, the child stared at the window as if it were a trick, like they'd cut a hole in the wall on a dare and forgotten to haunt it. At night she got up and stood in the hallway. The carpet there had a pattern that repeated in diamonds. She counted them. When she reached the end of the hall, she turned and started again, because the end of the hall is how you know what the beginning is. Once, her mother found her in the bathroom with the overhead fan on and the light off, hand under the stream of the sink. What are you doing, Bug? Her mother asked, and the girl whispered, practicing inside rain. The town adapted, the way towns do. The story shrank to fit in people's conversations. The mill put a flyer about stranger danger on its break room door with a cartoon policeman that had been photocopied so many times his smile was just a smudge. The church ran a seminar with coffee and donuts and a counselor who said the words trauma-informed and resilience and family systems. A woman who worked at the salon said Millie had asked for braids and felt funny cutting those. braids off later. She said the ribbon had to be blue, the woman said, not making a show of it, just sitting there with a mouthful of bobby pins and the honest terror of having put bows in a child's hair without understanding what she was tying. Greaves sat in county. He read books. He wrote letters to the editor that no one printed. He asked for materials to plan lessons. When they searched his house more thoroughly, they found little tape X's on the floor in one room, marks to show where furniture should go back, as if the room moved a fraction each night and had to be fixed in the morning. They found a plastic bin labeled seasonal, with 6 tablecloths folded inside, each with little acorns or hearts or snowflakes. At the bottom of the bin, under the cloths, lay a square of carpet cut from somewhere else, rolled up tight like a scroll. It had a pattern in diamonds. Hannah looked at the carpet square and thought of Millie's hallway. She thought of the speaker in the concrete room. She went back to the property on Walnut after the bank put plywood over the windows and locked the bulkhead with a real lock. She brought a warrant and a flashlight and stood in the concrete room with the lights off, because someone had to know what it felt like without the buzz. The dark pressed itself around her head like a hood. She could smell the last of the baby powder. When she tilted the light to the false window, she saw the screws had been backed out and put in again enough times to wear crescents in the paint like bitten fingernails. She thought of the dolls, how they had faced the bed as if they had been asked to watch over a sick child. She put her hand flat on the wall and felt, if she let herself, a thermal of cold, the suggestion of another air on the other side. Houses breathe, basements do too. She listened. She heard the sound every basement in Larchwood made when it was alone, the hairline crackling of concrete curing over decades, the far low rush of the river under everything, the electrical heart that doesn't know it's not a human heart because it beats anyway, the memory of a bell that was never hung here but hung somewhere. The girls in Millie's class made her cards that said welcome back and wanted to pet her like a pony, and their mothers pulled them away gently because they didn't want to be the mothers of that child's friends. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear of what closeness makes you see in yourself. The teacher, Mrs. Heller, spoke in a tender voice that flattened vowels into a kind of lullaby, and had them review the rules. Raise your hand, wait your turn, use your words, until rules felt like magic spells, and the classroom door like a talisman hung with construction paper. Millie watched the clock as if it might expand with watching. She sat too straight. She colored inside the lines until the lines looked ashamed. On the bulletin board, Mrs. Heller put up a paper house with everyone's names on construction paper doors. Home, it said. She meant well. She was the sort of woman who kept extra mittens in a drawer. It would only be later, when she took the house down, that she would notice Millie's door had been moved a fraction to the left, and then a fraction more, as if the house itself drifted. A week into her return, during free period, Millie asked for the bathroom pass and took the long way back. She walked the corridor where the fire exit stared blind into the gymnasium and stood in front of the old intercom speaker that had not worked since before the remodel. Its grill was dusty. A little lint clung in the corner like a gray moth. She reached up and pressed her palm against it. The boy who'd been lost under a man for decades looked out from behind the eyes of the man who had been their contractor, their Santa at Christmas, their anonymous donor, and said from a cell miles away, education environment, to a guard who had asked if he wanted air. The intercom said nothing. The building thrummed. When she returned to class, she asked if they could play with the dollhouse. The dollhouse was a nice one, donated last year by a parent who bought their child a fancier dollhouse and wanted the tax write-off. Mrs. Heller said yes and watched as Millie arranged the furniture. The bed goes against the wall, the child said. The table goes in the middle, the rug is round. She moved the tiny porcelain family like chess pieces. She sat them facing the bed. She found a spool of blue thread in the teacher's desk and tied a tiny bow for the tiny girl's hair. When Mrs. Heller suggested a window view, isn't it nice to pretend a view? Millie taped a blue square of paper in the window frame. It's the sky, she said. It's lovely, Mrs. Heller said, and felt the wild, cold thought that the loveliest things are often choices about what not to see. Summer came to Larchwood hard and green. The river smelled of fish and lawn chemicals. The mill put steam into the blue. The bank sold the Walnut Street place at a loss to a couple who wanted a project. They tore up floors and cursed the previous owner for using too many nails and too little care. On a Saturday, when the heat made the paper dust in the air look like snowfall, the husband pried up the false wall in the basement and said to his wife, hiding a room, and took a picture for the "you won't believe what we found" email that he would start and then never send. They stood in the bright dollhouse light and squinted at the ruffle on the bed, at the curtain bows. "Creepy," the wife said, but she said it like people say clowns are creepy. She didn't have all the story. She wasn't from here. She looked at the shelves and the regiment of dolls, now wrapped in plastic bags and stacked like a second audience, and said, "We'll yard sale these." The husband said, "Collectors will crawl out of the woodwork," and laughed to make it small. They kept working until the heat got too thick to swallow. Then they went upstairs and forgot to kill the switch. In the evening, the basement light reached under the door like a flat hand. Moths threw their powder at the fluorescents until they burnt out one by one with little coughs. Down the block, people grilled hot dogs and turned up radios and said to each other how nice the kids sounded. In the room, the speaker on the wall, still wired to somewhere, still the other mouth of a long, thin throat, clicked once, then again. Between clicks, if you stood and held your breath, you could hear something behind it that wasn't electricity. That wasn't the river, that wasn't anything any handbook would name. It sounded like a tide's breath. It sounded like a bell learning a new time. It sounded like a small girl pouring, saying thank you, teaching the dolls to listen. It sounded like a lesson beginning. Millie, in her bed in the duplex on Chestnut, woke to a noise she knew in her bones. Her mother, asleep in a chair, stirred and mumbled, but the child had already sat up, alert as a deer at the edge of a clearing. For a long time after, she flinched at the wrong bells: the school bell, the ice cream truck's song, the ding at the gas station. But that night she heard the right one. It rang once, clear, and then again, fainter. The house shifted around her as if turning to hear. Beneath them, the old bones of Larchwood's basements shifted too. Joists creaking, sump pumps burping, vents carrying secret air. The girl slid her feet to the floor, counting the diamonds in the rug without seeing them. She went to the window and looked out at the slice of night that belonged to her. On Walnut Street, a light burned in a room without people. In the mirror above her dresser, she saw her ribbon, blue against hair that had grown out in a ragged collar at her neck. She lifted it. She tied it. She stood very straight and smiled, the sort of smile that looks like practice. Then, in the quiet, she lifted one hand and made the small motion that meant pour. The motion hung there a second, small and polite and terrible. She didn't know why she did it, not exactly. She only knew that when the lesson starts, you have to do what the lesson asks, or else you won't be a good student, and not being a good student means the world will eat you. Down the street, a moth found the last light and flung itself at it. The light flickered, then steadied, then flickered again, as if blinking at something you cannot see unless you have been taught. Somewhere, a bell waited to be rung, and in the concrete room, bright as noon, boughs on the curtains, dolls heeled, neatly at attention, a draft moved across a chalkboard. The chalk dust rose in a little ghost and settled again on the word lesson. Under it, a new line wrote itself as if a careful hand had guided it, coming when called. The house at 12 Willow Lane was the kind that pretended to be harmless. It sat behind a stand of maples that had grown so wide you could hide a pickup truck between their trunks and a tangle of low stone walls that looked too polite to have anything to do with keeping things out, or in. The listing called it Historic Farmhouse with Potential. The town called it Old Barnes Place. The contractors, when they finally crawled under the joists and scraped the rot from the sills, called it, with the candor of men who work 6 days a week and think in plain nouns, a mess. Nobody said haunted. In a place like Graybridge, Massachusetts, where a mill chimney stubbed the sky and the high school's gym doubled as a voting precinct, nobody needed to say haunted. My name is Nate, 42, Divorced. One kid who spends every other weekend with me and the rest with an ex-wife who likes tidy lawns and lemon-scented cleaners. I work renovations, mostly with a crew of 3. Mason, the foreman, Benny, the kid, and me. The one who knows which beams you can trust and which ones will drop you to your neck in spiderwebs and mouse droppings if you look at them hard. We specialize in old places, character homes, the kind that make you cough when you say it because of the dust. The client on Willow Lane was a widow from Boston named Elaine, who wore her grief like a scarf. Elegant, tightly wound, sometimes, dragged through mud. Her husband had died the previous winter of a low-slung cancer that taught him a new language of pain in 6 months, and then took him before he could forget any of the vocabulary. She wanted a place to start over. "Rip out the basement," she said the first day we met her on the front porch. "It smells like a wet dog died in there." "Most basements do," Mason told her, smiling because he knew basements. "I mean seal it, insulate it, new floor, dehumidifier. I want it clean." "Clean," Mason echoed, like a man agreeing to an exorcism while wearing a tool belt. The first week was dust and the easy lies wood tells the living. The floorboards upstairs had swollen and separated like lips in a long grimace. We lifted them and found old newspapers from the 1960s, pages gone to felt, headlines half legible, Kennedy vows, winter of the century, town meeting tonight. The basement steps were untrustworthy, eaten soft at the edges. The air down there was a different temperature even in June, like stepping into the mouth of something sleeping. It had that drafted chill that finds your wrists and creeps. The light was one pull chain hanging from a porcelain socket. When it was on, you could see the particles hanging in the air, dust motes, lint, maybe spores if you wanted to be dramatic. When it was off, you could smell the iron in the concrete and something else, a Swedish note like old oranges forgotten in a drawer. We started by knocking out a stub wall someone had put up in the 70s. The studs were 2x3s, stapled paneling, no insulation, no point. I was on my knees with a pry bar when I felt the draft in reverse, air pulling inward from an old mortar seam where the foundation met the slab, like something breathing. "The other way? Feel that?" I asked. Mason crouched beside me, a ring of blue chalk dust around his boots. "Settling," he said, as if the word could do all the work. We marked the floor for a new drainage trench. Benny started the chipping hammer near the bulkhead, and the whole basement shuddered like a dog shaking water off its spine. The slab was thin, 2 inches in places, poured God knows when. We all knew, without saying, that there'd be surprises. Old wells, forgotten cesspits. Mason had once found a crate of milk bottles sealed with wax and something black inside each one like a dark thumbprint. Benny's hammer found something the second day. The bit chewed into concrete and then screamed as it struck metal. Sparks hissed. The smell that came up was different. Not the ordinary sour of wet limestone, but the tang of rust and the slime of very old water. We widened the hole with the sledge, and then, when the whole square was loose, we pried it up like a scab. Below, in the crawl space between slab and earth, lay iron. Not pipes, chains. They were flat on the dirt in a spiral at first, as if someone had coiled them neatly, a courtesy to no one. The links were big as the meat of my palm, gone reddish and rough, your skin snagging on them the instant you touched. Every 4 feet or so there was a ring set in a wedge of concrete, as if each chain had been an arm of a 6-star, each arm ending in something that would not come loose. The rings had been bolted through square plates into the earth below. Whoever had set them had done it with the patience of a craftsman and a particular kind of mind. Mason stood, hands on hips. He had stopped chewing his toothpick. That was his tell. "Well," he said at last. Then again, softer. "Well." Benny backed up, the kid's face gone gooseflesh, the look a person gets when a dark room suddenly has a purpose. "What's it for?" he asked. "For keeping things from walking away," Mason said, and his voice had no joke in it. We cut the slab around the finding, a line 3 feet out from the nearest ring. The floor shook as we worked. The house above creaked in the afternoon, like an old man shifting in his chair. We got the piece up in chunks, The echo hard in that low space, and then we had the truth of it. The chains weren't coiled. They were laid straight, dragged and then left, and the concrete on top wasn't original to the house. The places where the chain contacted the underside of the slab were rubbed clean, bright in spots like something had worried at them with time and desperation. Elaine came down the stairs while we were standing there, not calling down first. She had a habit of appearing like that, like a good ghost. The bulb swung on its chain when she stepped off the last riser, a sway that made the shadows queue up and then scatter as the light settled. "What is it?" she asked. Then she saw. Oh God. "We can call the police," Mason said. "We will call the police. But I want you to see what we're seeing." She covered her mouth with one hand. There were rings on that hand, 3 of them, the way people who carefully put their lives back together wear their rings. After a while she said, "Of course call them." We did, and Graybridge sent Officer Blum first. Squat, polite, hair cut like a brush you'd clean a grill with, and then Detective Tierney from county. The one who always looked like she had a headache she would never get to treat. They said the necessary things in the measured voices of people who had practiced them. They took photos. They examined the bolts, the plates, the rings. Tierney asked if we'd disturbed anything more than we had to. Mason said no. Benny said no. I said yes because honesty has a weight and I could feel mine growing. 2 photographs on an old board tucked behind the stairs, paper curled and stuck together with damp. One was of a girl with a gap between her front teeth around 12, taking a picture of whoever was taking a picture of her. The other was of a boy, younger, in a Halloween costume, a cheap plastic mask pushed up on his forehead so you could see he was smiling as if a joke was about to happen. I hadn't known if they mattered. I hadn't told. The photos were back in my truck, drying on the dashboard. Tierney studied the bolts like a jeweler. "Not manufactured," she said. "Somebody drilled and cut these, patchwork concrete, poured after the original slab." "Who'd do a thing like that?" Blum asked, as if asking would get an answer quicker than looking. Tierney didn't look up. "Someone who had time," she said, "and privacy." The cops took the chains, the plates, and a square of the slab with grooves worn into it like the paths of anxious animals pacing in a too small cage. They brought a short-handled 2-man saw for the concrete and swore softly when it bit and stuttered and the dust rose in a tasteable cloud. The house had a smell that day that stuck to us. Metallic, sweet, wet. And later, sitting in my truck with the photos drying, I realized it was the smell of iron and mildew, and something like old breath if breath could age and curdle. News has a way of spreading in a place like Graybridge. It isn't gossip at first. It's a murmur that travels by shoulder brush and obliging nod, the whisper of people in the produce aisle who don't look at each other when they speak. They found something at the Barnes place. Chains. A chamber. Like one of those murder podcasts. No, real. I heard the county's involved. You hear they're looking at the missing files. Which missing files? We had a few. That was how we said it. A few, the way you'd say a few bad storms, a few mugs lost between moves. In our town, the losses were mostly girls. Runaway, maybe, or not. One from a gas station in 2003. One walking home from a field hockey game in 2009. One from the bus stop on a mild September morning in 2015, when the crows had been unusually loud in the maples. The county had never said the words you want in those cases, connected, serial, because those words bother property values and re-election campaigns. But parents had said them softly sometimes and then stopped, as if the words themselves could put a hand on your throat. The sealed chamber revealed itself 2 days after the chains went to evidence. The ground under the slab trembled when the rain came. June thickened into a storm that hit the windows like handfuls of dry rice. The sump pump, which had been a faithful old machine, coughed and gave up. We kicked it awake and it died again. The water rose through hairline cracks and the floor became a pond with stubborn islands where the concrete was higher. Mason called in a plumber, and the plumber huffed blue language and left muddy prints on the steps. "Let it drop," Mason said finally. meaning we'd wait for the rain to blow past and the water to recede on its own. Then we trench. We came back on Thursday and the water had fallen by a foot. It wasn't clear water. It had the color of weak tea and the smell of the inside of old books. It had leached away the fines in the concrete, exposing the aggregate like the skin of a scab. At the far corner, under the stairs, the lines of masonry made an unnatural right angle where the foundation should have been a curve, a trough where someone had poured new against old. Different pour, I said. Patch, Mason agreed. We chipped there first. The new concrete came away too easily. The old underneath was harder, gravel locked in a cement that had decided decades ago to be stone and would not undecide. We made a hole big enough to fit a man through, and what stared back was a square room, 5 by 7, with walls poured smooth and a little too lovingly. There was a grate in the floor. There was a single eye hook set in the ceiling, dead center, its thread sunk into a blackened block. The room had been sealed with care. Someone had packed the gap between forms with tar before pouring the outer layer, then smoothed the face to match the rest. It wasn't a wine cellar or a root cellar or a storm bunker the way people like to narrate their architecture into harmlessness. It was a room designed so sound wouldn't carry. It was a room designed to be forgotten. Benny was the first to say it. Someone made this, he whispered, as if the admission could summon the maker. Elaine didn't come down the stairs that day. When we told her what we were doing, she shook her head. I can't, she said, and I believed her. She'd started, sleeping on a blow-up mattress in the dining room, because the bedroom upstairs creaked too much and the guest room smelled of lavender sachets and old heat. Just tell me, later. The cops came again with their blue gloves and their soft voices. Tierney used a flashlight to make shadows tell the truth. She ran it along the smoothness of the walls and the slick shine of the tar line. She didn't touch the eye hook. Don't, she told Bloom softly when he reached. They found hair in the drain. Not clumps, not a horror movie, just 6 strands caught like minnows on the grate. They found 2 buttons from a denim jacket, scuffed and furred, with lint. They found scratch marks on the underside of the stair stringer, small half-moons where fingernails had tried to be teeth. I watched all of this with a split feeling, as if my body were a room I might choose to leave. Part of me stood in the doorway of my own chest, hat in hand. Part of me knelt in the muck with the detective counting grooves. Tierney didn't say much, and what she said she spoke into a recorder. Sealed chamber beneath basement at 12 Willow Lane, she began, and the machine gave back her voice tinny and tired. Presence of restraints previously observed consistent with unlawful restraint. Evidence collected includes the town pulled back in a reflex of shame and curiosity. People who had once said hiya, Nate in passing now said, how's the work? Out there like a code. The old Barnes place was on lips and in prayer chains and sent around in group texts with emojis that didn't know where else to go. The cashier at Donnelly's Market told me her niece used to ride the bus with a girl who'd gone missing in 2015, the September one, and did I think? I didn't know what I thought. At night, the basement came with me. When I shut off, the light in my apartment, the swing of the pull chain followed me to bed. I lay on my back and counted the slow circles until they settled. In the half-sleep you earn between 12 and 1, I felt the draft at my wrist and held my breath and heard water moving in a dark pipe, a sound like teeth sucked clean. When I woke, it was because I had dreamed the concrete tasted like pennies and my tongue would not come unstuck. I started visiting my kid before school at the diner where his mother liked to take him on Thursdays. I watched him stir syrup into his chocolate milk until it made a ribbon that folded and disappeared. He told me about a video game where you build elaborate houses and then monsters try to break in at night. You can stop them, he said. You can build traps. Traps, I said, and it came out too dry. For zombies or bad guys, he said in the voice of a boy who had not yet learned that sometimes there is only the one category. You can keep your stuff safe. Yeah, I said, and coughed. Keep your stuff safe. The county announced their match 2 weeks later. It wasn't a press conference, not a banner headline, just a statement put up on their website that the papers quoted. DNA from the hair matched one of the families whose daughter had gone missing. In 2009, the denim buttons were consistent with a jacket she'd been wearing in a school photo. The chains, traced to a supplier in Worcester, had been sold in bulk to a hardware store that closed in 1998. None of that, Detective Tierney would tell us when she came back through, meant much by itself. People bought supplies, stores closed, time passed, but the story assembled itself like a skeleton assembling reluctantly in the sand. The county said there could be other matches coming, and everyone in town remembered other names. Some said them in their kitchens, and some said them at back pews, and some carried them like stones in their mouths. Elaine moved out of the dining room. I think she decided that if she was going to be the woman who owned the house on Willow Lane where chains were found, she might as well sleep in the room with the view of the maple leaves and the morning light like a clean sheet. She came down once to the threshold of the basement stairs and said, "What happens when you finish? Does it go away?" Mason told her the true thing that was also the only thing we could sell. "We'll seal it, we'll fill that room with foam and pour 4 inches of new slab. French drain, vapor barrier, sump that won't quit. It'll be dry. It'll be clean." "Clean," she repeated, and looked at me, not at Mason. I didn't know what she saw. A man who had not told the detective about 2 photographs, or a man who wanted a floor to stay a floor. We did what Mason promised. The foam came in big, cinnamon roll coils you fed into the void, swelling until it pushed back against your hand with a squish that made Benny giggle the first time and wince the second. We set rebar and wire mesh, like a fence under the earth. We poured the new slab, with the careful attention of men who want to believe in a thing's ability to stay put. When it finished curing, it was smooth enough to think you could eat from it. The chain marks were gone. But here is the thing about marks. Remove the physical, and you uncover the mental. People came by with Ziplocs of cookies and said they were for the crew, for our trouble. But their eyes kept sliding toward the bulkhead door as if it might blink. A churchwoman asked Elaine if she might like to do a circle, meaning a prayer group, and Elaine smiled that Boston widow smile and said, "Not today." After a while, there were flowers on the stone wall by the driveway, tied with purple, ribbons that didn't belong to any cause anyone could name. I saw a girl from the high school cross-country team run slowly past and touch the wall with 3 fingers without breaking stride, like an athlete keeping a positive ritual. I saw men parking to stare, their stubby fingers white on the wheel. Tierney came to the site one last time after the pour. She didn't touch the new floor. She stood at the threshold and nodded once like a carpenter registering the level of a table he would never eat at. "You'll move on to the next job," she said, not unkindly. "Sure," Mason said, eager to be ordinary again, to estimate someone a deck and argue about cedar versus composite. She looked at me, and this time I did know what she saw. The part of me that had knelt by the grate counting hair strands in my sleep. "You okay?" she asked. "I keep dreaming about it," I said, because honesty's weight had settled and found a groove it liked. "People think nightmares are about monsters," she said. "They're not. They're about logistics. Where the door is. If the lock works. How long the light stays on when you pull the chain." "I know where the door is," I said. "I know you do." We finished the basement. We installed the dehumidifier and watched it spit water into the drain with brisk little burst like a machine clearing its throat. We boxed the ducts and built a tidy closet around the sump. Mason shook Elaine's hand in the finished space and said, "Clean as a whistle." And we all stood a minute and listened to the room be quiet and respectable. I stayed a little later, because there is always one last sweep, one last trash bag, one last piece of blue tape to be peeled from a new edge. I stood alone in that room that had been 2 rooms, and had another room inside it once, like those Russian dolls you line up on a mantel and pretend they are the whole story. The light over the stairs was on. The bulb hummed that faint filament song you only hear when the rest of the world is obediently silent. I thought of the photographs, of the girl with the gap and the boy with the mask, and felt, not for the first time, the cinder of shame for not telling Tierney immediately, for thinking I could decide what mattered. The pictures had dried fine on my dashboard. I had taken them out and set them on my kitchen counter, and then I had slid them into the drawer where I keep takeout menus, as if a list of soups and a picture of a dead child could coexist without complaint. Later, I told myself. Later I'll bring them in. It is a terrible verb people use when they've decided to make a small deal with the past. Later. I went to the bottom of the stairs, tempted by a little mischief, and pulled the chain on the light to watch it swing. The circle of illumination moved politely over the floor. I watched it describe the boundaries we'd poured with so much assurance. I waited for it to settle. Before it did, something caught, a dull sheen only visible at the far edge of the circle, where the concrete hadn't fully lost its wet memory. I stepped closer. The floor wasn't wet, it wasn't even damp. But in the skim coat, in the topmost whisper of slurry, there were shallow tracks I couldn't unsee once I had seen. Not cracks, not crazing. Tracks, the way steel could leave, if dragged slowly in one direction and then another. The way children's fingers leave in frosting when they cannot help themselves. They were faint and slow. They did not match the old locations of the bolts or rings. Those were gone, and I had memorized their ghosted coordinates. These marks ran a new path, curving from the center of the room toward the sump closet, then pausing, then turning as if reconsidering. They ended near the wall we had patched. The marks were as precise as a name you don't want to say, and about that loud. Nate? My name came down the stairs like the end of a conversation I had forgotten I was having. I turned. Elaine stood at the top, a box of old books in her arms. She must have come in the bulkhead. The evening light from the side yard made frost patterns on the gray paint. Sorry, she said. Didn't mean to startle you. It's your house, I said. She came down, steps measured, and set the box on the landing halfway. She looked at the floor the way new homeowners look at floors when they want to be reassured that a floor is a floor. I keep thinking, she said slowly. What if someone knew and didn't say? I mean, not about the basement, about the girls. Years ago. She laughed without humor. Isn't that awful? To live in a place and think your neighbors could do that to you? Know and not tell? Awful, yes. Familiar, yes. In my drawer at home, 2 photographs lay in the dark. Outside, the maples lifted their leaves and shook them like green rattles. I started to say something, some platitude about people being afraid of what their words cause. And then I stopped because the bulb above us flickered. It wasn't a dramatic flicker. It was the small hesitation a heartbeat makes sometimes when you've climbed a flight of stairs too fast. The circle of light jittered on the new floor, and the faint tracks that weren't there followed the movement as if catching a signal. When the bulb steadied, the tracks had lengthened by the nothing distance between one heartbeat and the next. Did you see? Elaine began, and then decided against it as a sane person does. The way you don't say, "Is that my dead husband?" in the mirror when it is plainly your own tired face. Old wiring, I said. Clean as a whistle, she replied. And this time when she said clean, she made it rhyme with what it meant, as if she could conjure reality with careful diction. We carried the books up together. She thanked me, asked if we'd be by in the morning to take the last of the debris. I said yes. She went out to her car. I stood in the driveway where the stone wall made a short, polite boundary and watched a pair of teenagers cross the street to touch the ribbon someone had tied there. The sky was going the color of old apricots. When I locked up and turned to leave, I noticed the basement bulb still on, a faint glow between the stair treads. I hesitated, then went back inside, down, pulled the chain. The room went black so fast I could hear the echo of whatever tiny creatures live in walls. In that black, with my hand still on the chain, I heard something like a sigh. Not a human sound, not a ghost sound, but the sound a room makes when an old tension releases by the smallest amount. A twitch in the poured earth, the kind of sound foundations make when they recall their former arrangements. I have a theory I don't share at cookouts or in the diner or with my son over his chocolate milk. It is not a supernatural theory, though. I admit it wears a coat with that cut. Here it is. A place learns. It learns the shape of a footstep, the pattern of a grief, the timing of a slammed door. It learns the ratio of laughter to silence and the color of the silence when it thickens into something you cannot sop up with towels. The basement at 12 Willow Lane learned restraint. It learned what it means to carry a weight without moving. and what it means to know something terrible and stay quiet. For years it studied those lessons the way a child studies the face of a parent for signs that the storm is going to break. When we sealed the chamber, we did not unteach the basement. We gave it a clean top and no better answers. A week after we finished, they tied more ribbons to the wall. The county announced another match. The town held a vigil they called Unity, because that word is what you say when there are no other good words left. Elaine moved a couch into the basement, set a rug that didn't curl at the edges. People came over for iced tea. They stood on the new floor and did not know what they were standing on, and perhaps that is a merciful thing. Sometimes driving home late, I take Willow Lane, slow. I let the maples make stuttered patterns on the windshield. There are nights, clear, cool, when all that house is lumber and drywall and a woman trying. There are other nights when I swear I can hear a drag pause coming from under the bulkhead door, as soft as someone rearranging a chair so it faces the correct corner. I tell myself it is the sump. I tell myself it is the new slab settling. I tell myself a small life of useful lies that sound like the truth when you say them in the right tone. And sometimes when I wake in the dark at 3:17 for no reason at all, I know with a certainty that makes my teeth ache where the dreams have clenched them that the tracks on the new floor have shaped themselves into something legible. Not names, not initials. A word written in a dragging hand, letter by letter, making grooves in concrete as shallow as a whisper and as permanent as a confession.later. The storm came sidelong out of the county like it had a grudge to settle, the way they do in late August when the corn has grown high and heavy, and the ground resents every inch of water you try to pour into it. People will tell you later about the green bruise to the sky, the way the air smelled ionized and sweet, like a battery left too long on your tongue, and how, just before the worst of it, all the cicadas slipped into one nervous silence. I was already out wearing my second best, boots and my one good raincoat, because I work for the paper and we train ourselves to run toward smoke and sirens. Out on County Road 57 west of town, there's a farmhouse that belonged to a family people didn't talk much about unless they were feeling brave or mean, or both. The Harlows. The place had been empty for years, but empty doesn't mean harmless any more than a sleeping dog means safe. In the strobing white of the lightning, you could see how the old porch had slouched off its haunches, how the clapboard peeled like sunburned skin, how the roof line had a swayback you couldn't unsee once you'd seen it. I got there 5, maybe 10 minutes after the point in any storm where the world would be forgiven for simply letting go. A skinny volunteer from the fire department, kid named Rivera, met me with a flashlight and a jaw that jittered like he'd swallowed his own fillings. "Farmhouse gave," he said. "Just folded." It had. The middle of the house was a pile of wet matchsticks and antique nails, timber bones poking up like ribs through milk. There were men in slickers moving with that certain care you see around fresh wreckage, the kind that means they're listening for something they don't want to hear. "Any?" I began, and Rivera shook his head. "No one lived here," he said, but it sounded like he was trying to talk himself into it. The rain throttled down without ever stopping, the way a bad memory quiets but keeps its hands on you. Sheriff Colson's cruiser hunkered behind the volunteer trucks. He gave me the look he always gives, the one like an overdue bill. "Stay outside the tape, Dwyer," he said. "I'm outside," I said, and lifted my camera. Storm coverage. "We're all neighbors under the same cloud," he grunted. "Colson is a man who has never met a story he wanted told if it meant he had to do the telling." They'd cleared the living room, or what had been a living room, down to the studs when somebody shouted. The sound had that panicked, joyless edge that cuts through everything. A pair of volunteers pried up a section of flooring that hadn't been there in any blueprint a sane man would draw. The plywood was newish. Not new, but newer than the house, and beneath it, set flush into the joists, was a door of oak planks strapped with iron that had no business being under a rug. It was sealed. To be precise, it was sealed twice over. First with a rim of tar that gleamed in the wet light like black fat, and second with a bead of old gray epoxy that someone had smeared deliberately, patiently, the way you frost a cake when you want it to look store-bought. The edges were true. Whoever did it had cared. Jesus, said Rivera, not entirely softly. "That's a root cellar door if I ever saw one. All the farmhouses around here have cellars you can get at from inside. For winter or tornadoes are the kinds of secrets that like the cool. But those doors usually don't look like something you'd see in a prison or a ship." Coulson stepped up, his flashlight painting the wood in a hard cone. "Get me a pry bar," he said, and somebody did. The iron gave with a complaint that settled in that soft tissue just behind your ears. The smell that came out then was the smell of old apples and damp rope and 1,000 nights' worth of breath. I've walked into houses after the power had been off for a week, freezers full of things gone unmentionably wrong, and I have never smelled anything like that. Sweet in the way rot can be sweet, sticky sweet, but undercut with ammonia, like a pet store left out in the rain. It carried a note of bleach that made your sinuses prickle. I leaned over before I meant to, drawn the way you're drawn to any hole in the surface of your life. The beam of my flashlight caught steps going down, old boards worn shiny at the middle by feet, the edges fur-furred with splinters. On the 4th step there was a dark stain that had soaked in, gone gray and almost indistinguishable from the grain. Almost. In that weather everything sweat, including me. "Hold on," said Coulson, his hand a firm square in the middle of my chest. He nodded to 2 volunteers, and they went first, one with the light, one with the bar. I followed, because that's what I've trained myself to do in this job, and because something in me had understood, even before the shouting, that the Harlows hadn't left their house honest. The cellar was wrong. That's an infantile word for a grown man to use, but it fits. The walls weren't stone like you'd expect in a place like this. They were poured concrete, smooth as a dentist's tray, with hairline cracks mapped across in a fine network like the crazing on old china. The ceiling was low enough that Rivera, who's 6'2", had to duck his head. Light bulbs hung in wire cages at intervals, the kind you find in old factories, and when one of the men tugged a chain, 2 sputtered to life together with a buzzing, sound that made my molars ache. The first thing you saw was jars, shelves and shelves of them, a pantry excessive even for farm folks who learned to save sunlight for winter. Peaches blinked at us from behind their glass like the eyes of small animals suspended in syrup. Beans lay like little green bones. The labels were neat, printed, some in Ruth Harlow's fine schoolgirl hand that I recognized from church rummage. Signs of my childhood, August peaches 1989, dill pickles 2003. There were fresh labels too, ink that hadn't faded. 2011, 2012. Place went empty in 07, said one of the volunteers softly. Bank took it in 09. Those dates don't, hush, Coulson said. The second thing you saw, once your eyes made the jump from simple domesticity to the strain around the eyes of the domestic, were the clothes. A heap at first, then piles. Jeans with the knees blown out, one sleeve of a hoodie with letters you could feel more than see. Something floral, small enough for a girl who hadn't learned to stop being a child. Underneath, the hard pink glint of plastic, those cheap barrettes they sell at the dollar store, the ones my sister used to lose 2 at a time. There were soles separated from shoes and shoelaces still double-knotted, which is a detail I wish I did not have to remember. All of it was damp and preserved, not moldy somehow, not the way you would expect. The damp takes care of you if you let it in its way. The third thing you saw, and you did not want to say that word out loud because once you do you cannot unknow it, were the restraints. The crude ones, you know the kind. Belts buckled double with holes punched to make them smaller. Bicycle chains with the same padlock I had on my high school locker. Length of nylon rope melted at the ends. A ring bolt in the wall, 2 more, welded to a support post. The concrete around the center one wore a crescent of scratches as if someone, had twisted, again and again, in some wordless arithmetic of despair. Nobody spoke for a minute. The cellar took that silence in and exhaled cool air on us. The bulb's buzz evened out into a hum that became, if you listened, a kind of voice. Not words exactly, more the suggestion of a human mouth just before it begins to speak. Behind me, somebody crossed themselves, even though this is a town where religion usually happens inside heads or barns. I lifted my camera like a man lifting a weapon and took pictures that I knew would print black and white and poor and still be too much. On the far wall, In tidy kindergarten letters, someone had written the rules on a piece of painted plywood and nailed it there. Beneath it, in a hand that might have been either stern or careful, depending on your own private definitions: 1. No swearing. 2. No noise after 9. 3. No scratching at the door. 4. Say grace. 5. Save one. Save one. Rivera whispered. He had freckles that looked like constellations when he went pale. Save one what? We didn't answer. You don't, in places like that. You very specifically do not conjure anything if you can help it. Word went around faster than it should have. Not because anyone meant for it to, but because the air does a lot of the carrying in a town this size. Reporters from upstate came and set their cameras to wide angle and said the words urban legend with a little smile, like we were all hicks who told stories about hook-handed murderers. Meanwhile, our own people, the ones who had bought eggs from Ruth Harlow and who remembered Joe's laugh, which had been big and complicated like a hay baler, took it in like a sin they wanted to forgive before they knew the details. We always said the Harlows took in strays, said Miss Baird, who'd taught me handwriting when such things still mattered. She sat in her kitchen with a teacup that had a chip you couldn't avoid putting your lip on. Runaways, kids passing through on Greyhounds. You remember, Evan, we used to get the Greyhound set, the ones on their way to Detroit or Nashville, all hope and no money. Ruth used to set a plate for anyone hungry. It was a kindness. This is the most dangerous word in the language when somebody uses it to end a sentence. Kindness. We went back the day after the storm when the water had sucked back into the ground and the property had a wide yellow mouth of tape around it. Colson had done what he always did when something complicated threatened to happen. He called the state. 2 men from the state police came in suits that slicked the rain just by existing, and they went downstairs with kits and papers and faces that did not show the tiny muscle twitch under each eye. I went down again too, this time slower, because the cellar had changed in the way places change once they know they are seen. The heat of the day had brought a smell out of the concrete that was like cloves or old medicine. I noticed the chalk marks then, the scritches on the wall like a child keeping score. Sets of 5, etched in with something dull. Some sets faded, almost to the point of imagination. Others were fresh enough that the powder clung to the lines. If you put your finger to it, and I did, God help me, you came away with a gentle dust the same pale color as fresh flour. One of the state guys, the older one with a hairline like a widower's, crouched by a tin plate that had been set off by itself on the floor. He prodded it with a pencil. Dried, he said to his partner. You see the ring? Canned peaches. Not recent, not old. Middle. Come on, let's bag it. Bag what, I wanted to ask? The idea? Because the idea was the worst thing in that room, by a fair distance. The idea that someone had gone to the trouble to seal that door twice and then had used it after. That the jars on those shelves were a calendar and sugar and brine, a record of need and control. That the neatness of it, that last, fussy niceness, was the point. In my photographs, there are things I did not register until I blew them up later at the paper. The way the rope had been coiled into a just-so hang on a peg, wrapped around itself, and tucked back in with a knot like the ones I learned in Boy Scouts, which is to say with an attention to honor. The way a pair of shoes sat toe-to-toe under the shelf as if waiting to be put back on. A small wooden bird hung by a loop of thread. From the light cage, crude as a cave drawing and more tender than any curse word. You don't carve a bird like that unless somebody you care about asked you for it. Town says urban legend, one of the TV voices said into his microphone that afternoon, while the state guys did their slow, careful dance. And the sheriff looked, angrier than embarrassed, which was his tell. For years, rumors the Harlows kept a cellar the way some people keep a dog run. Teenagers gone missing, runaway kids from 3 towns over. You know how stories pile like snow. He smiled at his cameraman, not at us. They left before the light got that warm kind of late afternoon honey that makes even a crime scene look nostalgic. There were people who wanted to say the Harlows were monsters, and that made them feel safe. Because monsters are a special class of being you can't be. There were other people who wanted to say the Harlows were saints who had taken in the lost when the rest of us locked our doors. That made them feel safe, too, because sainthood is a thing you can outsource. The truth, as far as I could come to it, sat somewhere colder. Joe and Ruth had been small people who had taken a big idea into their house and fed it because it made them feel useful. The big idea was this: the world is too much for children, and the road eats them, and if you close your hand around the bird, it cannot fly into the storm. People can live a long time under meanings like that. In the church office, where the carpet was an unreasonably cheerful blue, I found a bake sale ledger. The ink had bled around the loops in a way that meant it had been written in the humid heat of a kitchen. There were notes. Eggs to Harlow, bread to Harlow, old jeans for the Harlow boy. There was no record of a Harlow boy living in that house by the time I was old enough to pay attention. Maybe he'd gone away to make his fortune. Maybe he'd never quite been one thing or another, never quite gone anywhere. How much of this did the town know and not know at the same time? You tell yourself someone else is looking and you don't have to look. There was a reason the scent of bleach rose up out of the concrete like a ghost. 2 afternoons after the finding, an envelope arrived at the paper addressed to me. No return. Address. Inside was a Polaroid, overexposed at the edges. The Harlow cellar, unmistakable, before the storm, no dust, light bulbs burning steady as if they were line power, not some generator hum. On the far wall, the plywood with the rules. In the photograph. There were 6 tally clusters and the beginning of a 7th. In person, as of that day, I had counted 14 clusters, some of them layered like the rings of a tree where someone had tried to write over the past. On the back of the Polaroid, in that same tidy hand as the labels, Save One. I tasted something. Metallic then. Not blood, not quite. But that tang you get when you bite your tongue and remember you have a body. I took the picture to Colson. He swore softly. A thing he only does when he thinks no one is watching who can put it in the paper. They poured that concrete 2 years after the bank took the deed, he said. Why? Who had a key? It's in the chain. We'll look. It's a funny thing, chain. It keeps. It also breaks at the same place every time, and then you replace the weak link with a new one and tell yourself it's different. The state boys found hair in the drain. Nothing gruesome. Hair is not a crime until it is. They sent it to labs where the air smells like gloves, and we waited for matches that may or may not come. These things take time. People got restless. Old man Whitaker leaned on the counter at Benny's diner and said very loudly that troubled kids do things to themselves, and that no one in this town ever hurt anyone who didn't need it. Miss Baird stopped me in the grocery and said, with tears in her eyes, that she once brought Ruth 6 jars of peaches after a hailstorm because Ruth cried when she spoke about the state of other people's children and how she couldn't sleep for thinking of them. What do you do with that? She asked me, and I had no answer. The bank sent a demolition crew and the county sent a concrete truck, and on a morning that smelled like wet dust and diesel, they poured out what they believed was justice. The concrete went thick and smooth, like new frosting into the mouth of the cellar. Men dragged the hose and made jokes because if you don't laugh while you bury something that has had hands on it, you might think too much about those hands. I stood back and took pictures that would look like any construction job, and we told ourselves that fixing a thing is the same as unmaking it. That night, because this is how stories trap you, I dreamed I was in the cellar with the bulbs humming. Only the glass on the jars had no labels. The peaches blinked faster and faster until the lids snapped with the little cough breath they make when they seal. In the dream, the last jar didn't seal. It sat with its lid slightly off, and the syrup crept out in a slow, clear tear. A week later, I was in the church basement. It was bingo night. The little sliding windows at the kitchen service bar were up, and there was coffee so strong it could stand up on its own. And there were cookies brought by women who had known my mother. The walls were cinder block painted a tireless beige. A door stood open at the back, one of those utility closets that serves as a graveyard for chairs missing a screw and folding tables with a limp. It shouldn't have caught my eye, it did. On the inside of that door with blue painter's tape was a paper sign in neat block letters. The rules: no swearing, no noise after 9, no scratching at the door, say grace, save one. I stood there, with a paper cup in my hand while people yelled B12 and, "You always call the same numbers, Ken," and the coffee steamed me in the face. The sign was an in-joke, probably. Somebody had heard the rumors and decided to be wicked about The tape's edges lifted a little in the damp air that comes with too many bodies in a summer rain. Behind me, a voice said, "Hey, Ev." I turned, and it was Coulson with a tired smile. He followed my gaze. The smile slunk away. "People think everything's a goddamn joke," he said in a voice that did not belong to the badge or the church. He plucked the paper down, crumpled it, and carried it to the kitchen trash where it lay like a white fist. I went home and stood at the top of my own cellar stairs a long time. In this part of the world, our houses are only as good as their cellars. Mine is the ordinary sort, stone foundation that weeps after a big storm, a washer that thumps, a light pull whose chain is always colder than you expect. The steps are pine, worn smooth by my own feet hurrying the laundry in and taking the laundry out. I turned on the light and whispered, "Hello," because that is what you do to a space when you want to make it behave. The bulb hummed. The smell was the clean, honest smell of bleach and dust and old cardboard, nothing else. We auctioned off the contents of the Harlow place years back, piece by piece, to strangers and neighbors and anyone who could say the words, estate sale, without tasting the copper. The old farmhouse sink sits in Caitlin Rogers' shabby chic kitchen downtown, full of peonies. The porch swing hangs on the Avery's second-story deck 3 streets over. Somebody bought a bundle of doors and window sashes for their rental units, and I bought 2 plain interior doors because the price was good, and because I had a feeling the house was going to need them, and who turns down a good feeling? Mine. Hang in my hallway, sanded, repainted, their scars politely hidden. There are notches on the top edge of the door to my bedroom. They look like old hinge marks, the kind you see when a door is rehung. 3 small half-moons cut into oak. Joe Harlow liked to reuse wood. That was the kind of frugality people admired about him. The notches line up neat as buttons. Sometimes, late after I've turned off the TV and the neighbor's dog has given up his argument with the night, I think they line up with other notches in other places. I think if you set them one against another like teeth, you could close a circle you don't want to close. 2 nights after bingo, I heard the soft clink of metal downstairs. Not loud. The house makes noises. Pipes put their shoulders into a new day. The gas meter keeps its count. The refrigerator remembers to be cold. This was none of those. This was the sound a chain makes when you nudge it with the toe of your shoe while you're thinking about something else. It came once and then again, in a rhythm that curled the small hairs on my arms. I stood on the first basement step and pulled the string. The light came up, rough and moth-colored. Nothing moved. The washer sat square in its corner, the laundry basket like a patient mouth waiting to be fed. On the far wall near the floor, there is a little square vent set into the stone, the kind they used to put in to keep the air from going sour. The breeze that came out of it was the ordinary breath of a house. It smelled of earth and a little of the wild onion that grows in our yard every spring. The grill over the vent rattled once more, a friendly little tisk like an old man scolding himself. A mouse, I told myself, because you have to tell yourself something. A mouse with a long tail that brushed the metal slats. On the shelf over the washer, there is a jar. It's one of those old ones with the ghost blue glass and a wire closure that I found at a yard sale on Cedar. It sat there because it looks nice with the clothespins inside. When I came up from the cellar that night, I saw that jar from the corner of my eye and stopped because the clothespins had shifted their angles into a different geometry than I remembered. I put my fingers around the jar and felt that it was a little warm. Not hot. Not even body temperature. Just that gentle mammal warmth of something near life. The next morning, because I am a reporter, and because the line between reporting and a man's need to not be crazy is blurry in a small town, I went back to the Harlow place. The county had filed the site in with gravel and fenced it with chain link. On the fence, a sign said, "No trespassing," in the municipal font that always looks cheerful no matter what it's telling you. The gravel lay flat, as if no house had ever stood there, and in the middle the concrete plug spread a neat gray cheek to the sky. Someone had thrown a handful of sunflower seeds by the fence, and a line of birds hopped and threw their velvet heads like drunkards at a disco. I stood there and took a picture of nothing. That evening, I printed it and tacked it to the corkboard over my desk. The concrete is a square, unimpeachably innocent. There are no shadows that look like faces, no messages in the gravel, but if you stare long enough, you might think the smooth middle is not entirely level. It sinks a little subtly like a bed that remembers a weight, as if there is under that cream skin of cement a space doing what spaces do when they've learned to be patient, breathing in and out, in and out, in and... I went to the basement then. The house was particularly quiet, like a dog after it has been caught with the couch stuffing in its mouth. The bulb hummed alive. On the far wall near the vent, a pale smudge had appeared that wasn't there a day ago. Chalk, a vertical line, then another next to it, then 3 more crossed through by a short diagonal, a schoolchild's accounting. 5. I am a man who does not scare easy if the scare is coming in front of me with a voice and a badge. What scares me is the way a town can go about its afternoon while keeping a thumb pressed very gently on the lid of a jar. We like our rules. We like to know what we can say and can't. We like to think kindness and its cousins can excuse anything, if we are small enough while we do it. Every place has a cellar. That's the truest thing I can say to you here at the end, in a voice that wants to be reasonable. A basement you build under the rest of your life where the air stays cool and the jars line up, labels careful in a pretty hand. You tell yourself you are saving something. You tell yourself that if you hold still enough and quiet enough, the road won't eat anyone else. You make rules so the darkness can be a room in a house. I stand sometimes at the top of my stairs, with my hand on the chain. The bulb sways a little from the last time I pulled it and makes a soft ticking sound as it warms. There's a bird cut into the underside of my top step. Tiny, just a triangle and a curve. A thing I thought was a knot in the wood until I rubbed my thumb across it and felt the deliberate cut. The air that comes up is ordinary. It is. But if you stand there long enough, 5 heartbeats, 10, you can smell a sweetness under the dust. Something canned years ago that did not spoil. A recipe passed down in the kind of handwriting that never wobbled even at the end. On the shelf, my jar sits with its wire clasp snapped snug. Inside, the clothespins hold their breath like small wooden bones. On the lid, in my scratchy reporter's hand, I have written a label on a square of masking tape because habits are harder to break than chains. Clothespins. August. Underneath, where only I will see it when I take the jar down and put it up again, I've written by accident or practice or muscle memory a second line, smaller. It says, "Save one." And when the house is quiet and the road is the only thing moving, the big black ribbon convincing kids in buses that there are softer nights ahead, I hear a small sound from the vent. It isn't a mouse. It's the sound of metal touching metal, patient and polite. A chain nudged by a toe. A reminder. A rule. A life we've poured concrete over that hasn't learned yet how to stop breathing, because no one ever taught it the mercy of an ending. The house on Briar Lane had 2 maple trees out front, both leaning just enough to make you feel they were trying to eavesdrop on the neighborhood. The grass was shaved too close to the dirt, and the porch paint had peeled into curls like fingernail clippings. If you drove past fast, most folks in Baxter did these days, you might have said the place just needed a good power wash, some new shutters, a woman's touch. You might have said a lot of easy, harmless things. That was before anyone went down into the basement. Deputy Marla Keene arrived on a Wednesday because Wednesdays were for welfare checks and dog complaints, things polite enough to keep the week from tilting. She'd been with the sheriff's department 9 years, long enough to know one rule. In a town where everybody knew everything about everybody, the most dangerous houses were the ones people forgot to talk about. The call came from a school secretary who said a girl named Bree hadn't been to class since Friday, and her mother, who worked a night shift at the packaging plant, hadn't answered her phone all week. "It's probably nothing," the secretary added, because that's what people said when they wanted you to get there fast. She mentioned she was staying with her uncle, Vern, the handyman, Vern Malloy. The name settled on Marla's dashboard, like dust. Everybody knew Vern. 52, thin as a hacksaw blade. He'd fixed half the leaky faucets in town for cash and did odd jobs at the church. Always had mints in his pocket, and a way of listening that felt like he was unspooling wire from your chest. People said he'd taken in his sister for a while when she was on pills. People said he was lonely after his mother died. People said he kept to himself, which can mean harmless or it can mean lock your doors. Marla knocked twice and listened to the hollow of the house answer. The air smelled of old coffee and detergent, a bleach bite beneath it. She shaded her eyes to the living room window and saw a tidy chaos inside. Coffee mugs stacked on newspapers, a crocheted Afghan folded on the sofa like something waiting to be inherited. A dog barked next door. Somewhere a lawnmower coughed. She circled the house, boots hissing in the cut grass, and found the bulkhead doors that led down to the basement. There were 3 new padlocks on the hasp. That was the first wrong thing, and she didn't need a warrant for that, not with a missing child and 3 shiny locks on a rusted door. She radioed for backup and waited, because that was procedure, and because the basement seemed to be listening with its breath held. Deputy Ronnie Pelt came first, all elbows and eagerness. Then Sergeant Darnell Hart with the crowbar he kept in his trunk for people who confused private property with fortress. They popped the locks and the doors sighed open on damp air. "Hello?" Marla called. Her voice didn't echo so much as soak in. Basements in Baxter had a look. Stone or poured concrete, either way painted that same hospital green back in the 70s. Fluorescent light with a pull string, pegboard holding tools like trophies. The smell was always a mix of mildew and memory, school projects stored in boxes, the last Christmas tree stand, paint cans with crusted lips. This basement had all that and another smell besides. Not rot. Not yet. More like wet cardboard left in the trunk too long. It was colder down there than the day required, as if the heat didn't agree to come that far. Marla and Ronnie went down the wooden steps that bowled slightly underfoot. Darnell waited at the top, gun drawn but pointed at the floor because he'd been taught not everything deserved the muzzle. There was the pegboard, the workbench neat as a dentist's tray, hammers sized and hung in ascending order. There were the jars. Of screws, the sawhorses folded like praying insects. There was a washer and dryer and a basket full of stale towels that smelled of old sunshine. And in the far corner, under the small window that showed a strip of yard and one root like a clutching hand, sat a chest freezer. The kind you buy when you find venison on sale and have dreams of feeding a big family. White once, now the color of rained-on chalk. A black extension cord dangled from the outlet above it, unplugged, as if the freezer had been told to behave. "Looks like an old cold line," Ronnie said. "My grandma had one. Used to keep ice cream like a grave is cold." Marla stared at the latches. They weren't latches anymore. Someone had bolted a steel plate across the lid and screwed it into the body with a dozen thick screws. A padlock hung from the plate. She touched the metal, and it came away tacky with grease. "Darnell," she called, "bring the bolt cutters." The first snip made a sound like a tiny animal screaming through its nose. She winced. The second snip dropped the padlock to the concrete. The freezer lid didn't leap up. It pressed down stubbornly as she lifted, sticky, reluctant, and then gave with a sigh heavy enough to be a body's. The smell reached them then, stale breath, old plastic, something that had not seen the sun in too long. Marla breathed through her mouth and looked in. At first her mind refused to make sense of it. That happens when you see a thing that hums to your primitive parts but not your trained ones. Your brain smears it like a thumb over chalk until it's safe. But it wasn't safe. 2 faces looked up, pale, gaunt, eyes sunken like thumbprints. A third face turned sideways and blinked at the light, as if it were a story being told too fast. The smallest one said, in the dry voice of a paper cut, "Please don't shut it." They were alive. 3 children, bundled in thrift store blankets, knees like knots. A plastic water bottle rolled between them, half full. A bowl crusted with dried oatmeal. The inside walls were lined with silver mylar and holes had been drilled in rows along the rim, the punctures dark with dust and maybe a little rust. "Sweet God," Ronnie said. He stumbled back, almost fell over the laundry basket. Darnell swore, softly upstairs, the profanity of a man who had seen more than enough and understood it. Would never be enough. Marla swallowed hard. Her hands wanted to shake and her training told them to be still. She crouched and spoke with a voice she borrowed from childhood, the one that calms a dog under a bed during fireworks. "I'm Marla. I'm a police officer. You're okay. We're going to get you out, all right?" The older girl flinched at the word out like it was a trick. He had built a lip, Marla realized. A little ridge under the lid so small fingers couldn't pry it. He had thought of that. He had thought of a lot. The paramedics came with blankets that crackled like big autumn leaves. Somebody turned off the fluorescent light, and the basement grew softer in the dim, though that somehow made it worse. The children were lifted gently as if the air might bruise them. The smallest boy put his hand over his face when he reached the open air upstairs, as if the ceiling might fall, as if the sky had been forbidden. While the house filled with people, who were trained to move in neat lines and say the right words, Marla walked into the kitchen and saw the notes Vern had left for himself on the fridge. "Buy more oatmeal Thursday. Check vents. Church potluck. Baked beans." There was a printed verse from Psalms held under a magnet shaped like a trout. The verse mentioned still waters and a soul restored. The magnet said, "Baxter Lake, best fishing this side of heaven." She found Bree's mother 2 hours later, eyes wild, hair in a clip that had given up. At the hospital, the fluorescent light was cleaner but no kinder. The mother kept gripping Marla's sleeve like a girl lost in a fairground. "They said there were 3, she whispered. "Is one of them?" "They're alive," Marla said. The words felt like borrowed money. "You spent them and already owed more." "They're malnourished, but alive," the mother repeated and began to cry like a tire losing air, a soft, hopeless sound that seemed to go on and on. They didn't find Vern that day. They found his truck behind the church and his phone in the glove compartment as if it really were the 1980s, and he believed phones belonged to the car, not the man. Pastor Harlan said Vern had been talking about a hunting trip even though it was spring. He said he was checking his traps, the pastor admitted, then flinched at his own words. "I thought he meant, well, you know, raccoons. People come apart in 100 petty ways when something like that happens in a small town. They make casseroles suspiciously quickly. They talk about how they always felt a little off around a man, or how they never saw it. Not once, not ever. They find reasons why it could not have been their fault the world had rotted a little under their feet." The police chief held a press conference and the news crews came with their wet eyes and captive concern. The newspaper ran a photo of the house that made it look like it might cry if only you pressed a hand to the siding. But the house remained a house. Marla went home and stood in front of her own freezer for a long time. It sat in the mudroom humming obediently, a square cousin of the one in the basement, white and stupid as a cow. She pressed her palm to the lid and felt the cold through, the plastic cladding. The house creaked, old wood adjusting to night. She drew her hand back and washed it for too long, the water reddening her knuckles. Sleep did not come easy, and when it came, it brought a kind of museum dream, each room preserving a different sound. The freezer hummed, the screws squealed. A child said please. She woke with her jaw sore from clenching and a taste in her mouth like pennies. They found Vern 2 days later in a motel out by the highway. He had checked in under his own name, which told Marla something about men like him. They believed they were doing the right thing even as they arranged lies around themselves like sandbags. He had a duffel bag and inside was a Bible, a jar of oatmeal and a box of 1/4-inch self-tapping screws. He went quiet at the station, his face settling into the emptiness Marla had seen on men who had decided they would no longer be surprised by anything the world could do to them. When he did speak, it was about the weather. "We had a cold snap," he said. "You remember? Back in February. Pipes froze in half of Baxter. People forget how fast cold can get into you if you're not careful." "Tell me about the children," Marla said. Vern folded his hands the way some people do when they have been taught folding hands makes their words cleaner. "People don't watch their own," he said. "I seen it for years. Leave a kid in a driveway while they carry groceries in. Leave a kid in a church pew while they smoke out back. Leave a kid in the summer like heat can't burn. I figured I could do better. I could keep them safe. Cold keeps things, cold preserves." He smiled then, a thin thing that tried to be kind and came out like a cut. "Freezers are meant to hold," he said. That's the point, Marla thought, of his careful notes and the air holes drilled with the stubborn neatness of a man who did everything the right way twice. You locked them in a box, she said. Vern's eyes were an old dishwater blue. The world is a box, he said. At least mine had boundaries, and I wasn't going to let them. He stopped himself. His mouth trembled, not with remorse, but with the indignity of being misunderstood. The world talks too much, he said. You can't hear anything over it. In there it's quiet. They learn to listen. She could have asked where he found them, and she did, and he told her with shrug-soft pride. The gas station, the playground behind the apartments, the church picnic. Just for an hour, he said, as if time itself had oiled him into civility. He didn't use the word kidnap. He said took in. He said looked after. Everything he said circled like water around a drain, not yet gone but already pulled. When the public defender arrived, he clasped Vern's shoulder like a brother and led him away. It was imperfect mercy, but mercy all the same. The children were returned to parents who had practiced the speeches they would give to cameras and then forgot them standing under the hot lights. Bree's mother took Bree home to a clean apartment that smelled like pine cleanser, and for a while people left lasagnas on her doorstep and packages of teddy bears appeared like mushrooms after rain. Bree ate small bites like a bird and slept, with the light on because darkness felt like another door closing. At school, someone tried to make a joke about freezers in biology class, and the teacher sent him to the office, and then went in the supply closet and cried on a stack of copy, paper. People look for heroes as soon as they admit there are monsters. They kept telling Marla she'd done a brave thing, but it felt different inside her bones. It felt like she had been listening to a house that at last had decided to tell the truth. The freezer became evidence, plastic wrapped and tagged, and sat in a chain-link pen behind the sheriff's office. Crows gathered on the fence and stared at it with an intensity that made Marla uncomfortable. They're just birds, Ronnie said, but the crows had a way of leaning toward the freezer, heads cocked, as if waiting for whatever it had been, taught to hold. In the evenings, when the paperwork was done and the phones rested like sleeping snakes on their cradles, Marla sometimes went out back. The sun slid down behind the municipal building and took the town with it, throwing long shadows that made the pen look like a cage underwater. She would stand and listen. She told herself she only heard the highway's distant shush and a delivery, truck's backup beep and the slap of a distant screen door. She told herself the freezer was only a box of metal and insulation, but there were nights when the air sank in cool, the way cellars do even in July, and she thought she heard a small, patient sound from inside the white coffin, not a voice. The absence of a voice, a place where a voice once was and might be again. On a Sunday morning 2 weeks after the rescue, the pen's lock was found hanging open. The chain-link gate asked an obvious question. The freezer was still there, but the padlock on its lid had been replaced with a new one. Shiny brass. No one in the department admitted to adding it. Darnell rubbed his mustache and sighed. Kids, he said. They'll screw with anything. Kids don't carry padlocks, Marla said. The brass was warm when she touched it, as if someone had only just let go. A thin smear of grease marked the hasp. They cut the new lock. The lid lifted like it always did, with that reluctant surrender, adhesive giving up after too long. Inside lay coal-black darkness except for the pinholes around the rim that let in a necklace of day. No faces. No bowl, no bottle, just the lining torn in a corner where one of them must have picked until it gave like a scab. The smell was still there, something like old breath, and something else now, folded beneath it. The ghost of a hymn, maybe, or just the way air speaks to itself in small rooms. The county took the freezer to the dump after that, claiming chain of custody didn't require keeping a box forever. At the dump, the loader pushed it toward the appliance pile where refrigerators and ovens stood like mismatched tombstones. A man with a tattoo of a snake around his wrist wiped sweat with his forearm and said, "You wouldn't believe what folks throw out." He laughed a regretful laugh, the kind that both loves and resents the world. The loader turned, the bucket bumped, the freezer rocked, tipped, fell. The lid thudded closed. The sound it made was hollow and contained. A door, closing on a word that had been about to be said. Life in Baxter rearranged itself like a living room after a divorce. Some things didn't come back where they were before. Pastor Harlan stepped down and the church hired a younger man with a beard you could trust. The school installed cameras that made parents feel braver and children feel watched. Breeze. Mother got a better-paying job at the plant and started running at dusk, shoes ticking the sidewalk like a clock that meant business. People still waved at each other in traffic, but now their hands stayed on the wheel a heartbeat longer. Vern turned out to have a past everyone had politely forgotten. A cousin said he used to lock himself in closets as a boy. A neighbor said he would let his mother's cat into a carrier and leave it there, singing to it through the slats. The stories arrived late and useless, like umbrellas on a sunny day. In the end, he pled to enough that the judge called it mercy again. The judge said the word rehabilitation and also said confinement, as if the difference between the two was mostly posture. On the first truly hot night of July, the power went out. It wasn't just Baxter. The whole county slid into a darkness shaped like the map. People came out on porches with their shirts stuck to their backs, their flashlights making fat, clumsy cones. Someone down the block played a battery radio and the announcer used the word rolling to describe the blackouts, a word that made it sound as if bad luck had wheels. In her mudroom, Marla stood with the freezer. Its hum had gone silent, and the silence had the shape of it. Without the sound, the appliance became a thing that expected. The house creaked in that summery way, wood expanding like bread in an oven. Far down the street, a siren did its lonely loop and cut. She thought of the pen behind the station, of the crows, of the brass padlock warm from a stranger's hand. She thought of the bulkhead locks in the bleach-smelling basement. She thought of Vern, who had wanted to keep things safe. Preserve, he had said, as if that were prayer. There came then, from inside her freezer, a sound. Not a thump, not a rattle, a whisper against plastic, the soft slide of a palm, a careful, practiced touch. Just once, as if someone inside, who had learned to ration everything, even hope, had decided to let her know they were patient. Her hand went to the lid. The rational mind blares at such moments, cocks its hat, tells you what is and is not possible. She could hear her own voice, trained by years of paperwork and procedure, saying it was only the seal cooling, only pressure equalizing, only the old house gossiping in weather. She could also hear the other voice, older, not trained by anything but life, saying, "Listen." That was the voice that had led her down the basement stairs, the voice that noticed locks without stories and windows that looked like blinking. "Doe," whisper came again, a hush against the lid, the idea of fingers in it. Marla opened the freezer. Cold air rose, blue and clean, and wrapped her wrists. Her flashlight made a white channel. Frozen peas, a stack of pork chops slicked with ice. 2 trays of soup labeled in her own blocky hand. Chicken, March. The cold breathed out a fog that smelled like everything good she had kept for later. She let herself exhale, and because she was tired, truly tired, from weeks of waking inside glass and not knowing how to step out, she laughed. It was a small laugh. It hurt. She closed the lid. From the dark of her kitchen came the stair creak, a step where no step should be, the sound of the house shifting to admit a new weight. She swung the light and caught just a strip of doorway, the air there slightly different, as if a window had opened in a room she'd shut. "Hello?" she called. Her voice was steady. The word fell into the quiet, didn't come back. She thought of basements, of boxes meant for meat and ice cream and in the wrong hands for small breathing things. She thought of how a freezer is only a promise, really. Keep what you love in here and it won't turn. Keep what you can't face in here, and maybe it will stop asking to be seen. Down there, in that house on Briar Lane, the box had learned a lesson about holding. Up here, in her kitchen, Marla realized something else. Some containers, once taught, never forget. She set her palm on the lid one. Last time, it pulsed with the cold doing its job. From upstairs, the creak came again, the sound of someone deciding. From outside, a breeze slid through the screens and made the curtains billow as if they were breathing. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a generator coughed to life and made a sound like a hive waking. When the power returned, the lights juddered and then burned with a too bright politeness. The fridge rattled. The freezer found its hum, that sleepy, constant thing. The house pretended it hadn't admitted anything it shouldn't. Marla stood for a long time, listening to the hum until it buried the other sounds, until it filled the spaces labeled fear and mercy and procedure. On her table, the flashlight gave up, a dying glow that tried very hard to be enough. She waited there in the kitchen, under the light that showed every crumb and every smudge of a life lived with intention, and she was still waiting when she heard it a third time. Not from the mudroom, not from the stairs, but from the vent in the floor near her feet. A small, patient whisper, as if someone below the floorboards had put their mouth to the grate and learned the shape of a word they would say only when she was ready to hear it. Please. The vent breathed. The hum went on, and the house, which had hoped to be left alone, understood it would not be.